They thought the bunkers would save them. Thick concrete walls, iron doors, and narrow firing slits made the German infantry feel untouchable. Inside those dark chambers, they waited confidently, convinced no enemy could reach them. But when the Americans arrived, they brought with them a weapon unlike anything the Germans had faced before. With a single roar, fire surged through the air, liquid flames that bent around corners, crawled through openings, and turned sealed rooms into raging infernos. Panic spread instantly. The defenders who had trusted their fortifications suddenly found themselves trapped inside a burning tomb. Some screamed, some begged, some surrendered without hesitation, while others vanished in the blaze. For the Germans, it was unthinkable, their strongest defenses had become their death traps. For the Americans, it was proof that fear itself could be wielded as a weapon. This was not just war, it was fire unleashed. World War II was filled with weapons that shocked, terrified, and reshaped the battlefield, but few carried the same psychological weight as the flamethrower. For American forces, it was not just another tool of destruction, it was a key to unlocking the seemingly impenetrable German defenses. Across Europe, the Wehrmacht had fortified villages, forests, and bunkers with the confidence that steel and concrete could hold back any assault. To them, a bunker was safety. To the Americans, it became a target. The flamethrower changed the rules of war. Unlike bullets or shells, fire did not stop at walls. It slithered into every crack, every vent, every dark corner where a soldier thought he was hidden. The moment the flames erupted, the fight was no longer about strategy, it was about survival. Entire squads collapsed in chaos, their courage consumed in seconds. This story is not just about a weapon. It is about fear, about how a single blast of fire could shatter the strongest defenses, and about how America's flamethrowers turned. This story is not just about a weapon. It is about fear, about how a single blast of fire could shatter the strongest defenses, and about how America's flamethrowers turned the battlefield into something closer to hell itself. And in those moments, the Germans learned that even the safest bunker could become a fiery grave. German bunker mentality. For the German infantry, the bunker was more than a structure, it was a symbol of invincibility. Built from reinforced concrete, buried into hillsides, and camouflaged beneath earth and trees, these fortifications gave soldiers the illusion of safety in a war that had stripped away nearly every other comfort. Inside, the air was damp and cold, the walls thick enough to withstand artillery shells, and the narrow firing slits provided carefully controlled views of the battlefield. To the men stationed within, the bunker felt like a shield against the chaos of modern warfare. The German High Command had invested heavily in these defensive systems. Along the Atlantic Wall, in Normandy, in the forests of Hurtgen, and across countless villages in France and Belgium, bunkers became the backbone of their strategy. A single machine gun crew inside could stall entire platoons of advancing troops. Mortars and rifles positioned in interlocking fields of fire created deadly kill zones. Commanders assured their men that these fortresses would buy time, bleed the enemy, and hold back even the strongest American advances. For the infantry assigned to man them, life inside was monotonous but reassuring. Soldiers played cards, smoked, wrote letters, and shared meals while artillery thundered harmlessly outside. The walls absorbed the pounding of shells, and even when the earth shook violently, the bunker endured. To men living in constant fear of air raids, tank assaults, and artillery barrages, this sense of protection was priceless. There was also a deep psychological confidence that came with the bunker. It gave German soldiers a belief that they were in control of the battlefield, able to observe, to fire, and to retreat deeper underground when danger grew. They knew that even if the Americans launched a massive assault, the bunkers could resist until reinforcements arrived. But this sense of security was an illusion. What the Germans did not yet realize was that these fortresses, so carefully built to withstand bullets and bombs, were fatally vulnerable to a weapon designed not to destroy walls but to consume everything within them. The very feature that made the bunker effective, its ability to trap men inside, would soon become its greatest weakness. Birth of the flamethrower. The idea of projecting fire as a weapon was not new. Since ancient times, armies had experimented with fire as a tool of terror, from flaming arrows to the dreaded Greek fire that once lit up medieval seas. But it was during the grim years of the First World War that the modern flamethrower first appeared, introduced by the Germans themselves. At Verdun and other battlefields, the sight of soldiers spraying jets of flame into enemy trenches horrified Allied troops. Even then, it was less about killing large numbers and more about breaking morale. Few men could fight when fire raced toward them. When the Second World War erupted, the weapon returned, but this time, the Americans were determined to improve it. The early models were heavy, unreliable, and prone to dangerous accidents. Engineers reworked the design, creating the M1, and later the M2 flamethrower, which became the most recognizable version of the war. The device was simple in appearance: two cylindrical fuel tanks strapped to a soldier's back, connected to a hose and nozzle that could unleash a stream of burning gasoline. With a range of 20 to 40 yards, it allowed one man to do what artillery and rifles could not: reach into the enemy's most secure hiding places. But what truly made the flamethrower terrifying was not its mechanical design, but its psychological impact. Soldiers who trained with it often described mixed feelings. Some saw it as a practical tool, essential for clearing pillboxes and bunkers that otherwise cost too many lives. Others felt uneasy carrying such a weapon, knowing it would make them a priority target. Flamethrower operators were often singled out by the enemy. Germans and Japanese alike fired on them first, knowing that as long as the operator was alive, no position was safe. In American training camps, men drilled in using short, controlled bursts rather than long streams, learning to conserve fuel and shock the enemy at just the right moment. They were told the weapon was not designed for indiscriminate burning, but for tactical strikes that forced defenders out into the open where rifles and machine guns could finish the job. Still, many admitted that once the flames erupted, chaos often followed. By the time American troops prepared for their campaigns in Europe, the flamethrower had become more than just another weapon in their arsenal. It was a symbol of technological ingenuity and raw fear, a tool that could turn the safest German stronghold into a death trap within seconds. First encounters in Europe. When American forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, they faced a fortress unlike anything they had seen before. The Germans had transformed the coastline into a labyrinth of steel and concrete, pillboxes, machine gun nests, and underground bunkers all linked by tunnels and trenches. Artillery and naval bombardments had pounded the defenses, but when the smoke cleared, many of the bunkers still stood, their defenders alive and ready to fight. For the infantry clawing their way off the beaches, these strongpoints were deadly roadblocks that had to be neutralized quickly. The answer, as many soon discovered, was the flamethrower. For the first time in Europe, German soldiers found themselves confronting a weapon that could penetrate where bullets and shells could not. A single American flamethrower team could change the outcome of an assault. Witnesses described how the moment fire burst into a firing slit, panic erupted inside. Machine guns fell silent. Shouts of command turned to screams of terror. In some cases, defenders bolted from their bunkers with their hands raised, preferring the shame of capture to the agony of fire. At Omaha Beach, stories spread among the infantry of bunkers collapsing not from explosives, but from the sheer shock of fire. Men who had endured hours of shelling surrendered within seconds when flames licked through their defenses. German prisoners later admitted they had never imagined such a weapon would be used so decisively against them. Many believed their fortifications were indestructible, yet a weapon carried by a single soldier had undone their sense of security. As the Allies pushed inland, these encounters became more common. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, where Germans turned farmhouses, barns, and even cellars into miniature fortresses, flamethrowers became essential. Narrow lanes and thick vegetation made it difficult to use tanks effectively, but a man with a flamethrower could approach, unleash fire through a window or doorway, and flush out defenders. The psychological impact was immediate. Even the most disciplined soldiers were shaken by the sight of burning fuel crawling along walls and ceilings. Eyewitnesses recall moments that bordered on the surreal. A German machine gun nest, silent and impenetrable for hours, would suddenly fall quiet after a burst of fire. Sometimes, there was no resistance afterward, only charred weapons and abandoned positions. Other times, soldiers stumbled out coughing, blackened by smoke, their will to fight gone. For the Americans, this was proof of the weapon's effectiveness. For the Germans, it was a nightmare they had not prepared for. The first encounters in Europe sent a message that spread quickly across the front. The concrete shelters and dugouts, once symbols of safety, could no longer guarantee survival. And as word spread among German ranks, fear traveled with it. The flamethrower was no longer just a weapon on the battlefield, it was a legend, whispered about in trenches and bunkers, a terror that arrived without warning and left only silence behind. Pacific lessons applied to Europe. Long before American soldiers faced German bunkers, the flamethrower had already earned its reputation in another theater of war, the Pacific. Against the Japanese, the weapon had proven both brutally effective and psychologically devastating. On islands like Iwo Jima, Saipan, and Peleliu, Japanese defenders dug deep into volcanic rock, carving out caves, tunnels, and pillboxes that resisted artillery barrages and even aerial bombardment. For infantry trying to advance yard by yard, these hidden fortresses became death traps. The solution was the flamethrower. Marines and soldiers quickly discovered that flame could do what explosives could not. It traveled into the cracks and shadows of caves, filling spaces with smoke and fire, forcing the defenders either to flee or to perish inside. Reports from the Pacific described entire strongholds collapsing after a few short bursts, with survivors staggering out blinded and choking. The weapon became synonymous with cleansing, a grim term that reflected its role in burning out resistance from places where no other tactic worked. By the time American forces turned their full attention to Europe after D-Day, many of the lessons learned in the Pacific had already been absorbed. The doctrine was simple but effective: suppress the enemy with small arms, close the distance, and then unleash fire at the precise moment when defenders thought themselves safe. In the Pacific, this tactic had saved countless American lives. Now, the same approach would be applied against the Germans. There was, however, a crucial difference. Japanese soldiers, bound by a culture of fighting to the death, often refused to surrender even when fire reached them. Many perished in caves or bunkers, choosing death over capture. In contrast, German soldiers, despite their discipline and training, were far more likely to surrender once they saw flames erupting near their positions. Accounts from both American and German veterans highlight this contrast. While Japanese defenses often required repeated and merciless assaults, German defenders frequently broke quickly under the psychological weight of fire. This difference reinforced the view among American commanders that the flamethrower was not just a weapon of destruction but a weapon of fear. In Europe, where battles were fought across villages, forests, and fortified lines, fear could be just as decisive as firepower. A single burst into a bunker might spare dozens of American lives by forcing a surrender without prolonged fighting. Thus, the Pacific became a proving ground. By 1944, when U.S. forces encountered the Atlantic Wall, they were already veterans in the use of flamethrowers. They knew how to carry them, how to protect the operators, and how to combine them with infantry tactics. The Germans may have believed their bunkers were unassailable, but the Americans brought with them hard-earned experience from another war half a world away, experience that would turn concrete shelters into blazing traps in Europe. Battle Case Study: the Hurtgen Forest Infernos. Among the many places where flamethrowers changed the tide of battle, the Hurtgen Forest stands out as a chilling case study. This dense, mist-covered woodland near the German border became the scene of one of the longest and most brutal battles fought by American forces in Europe. Between September and December of 1944, U.S. divisions pushed into the thick forest to break through the Siegfried Line, a network of German fortifications that shielded the Reich. What awaited them were mines, barbed wire, machine gun nests, and, most of all, bunkers hidden deep among the trees. The Germans believed the forest would fight for them. Its narrow trails, steep ravines, and constant fog gave defenders the perfect terrain to ambush advancing Americans. Concrete bunkers dotted the hillsides, their guns sweeping open clearings with deadly precision. Time and again, U.S. infantry attacks were cut down, and artillery struggled to silence the positions hidden beneath layers of earth and reinforced concrete. For the soldiers trapped in the nightmare of the Hurtgen, it seemed as though nothing could root the Germans out. But the Americans had brought their flamethrowers. Small teams crept forward under covering fire, their operators carrying the heavy tanks on their backs. The job was one of the most dangerous in the army. Flamethrower men were obvious targets and knew the odds of surviving repeated assaults were slim. Yet time after time, they stepped into the line of fire because their weapon was the only one capable of reaching inside the bunkers. Eyewitnesses describe how a single burst of flame could silence a position that had held out for hours. The jet of fire would roar through a firing slit, and within seconds the machine gun chatter would stop. Sometimes defenders stumbled out coughing, their uniforms singed, their hands raised in surrender. Other times, there was only silence, the bunker reduced to a tomb. American riflemen moved in behind the flame, securing positions that had once seemed untouchable. The psychological shock was immense. One German prisoner later confessed that the sound of a flamethrower igniting filled him with more terror than any artillery bombardment. Soldiers spoke of the flames as if they were alive, crawling along ceilings, wrapping around corners, and chasing men who thought they were hidden. In the confined spaces of the Hurtgen bunkers, there was nowhere to escape. For the Americans, these successes came at a heavy cost. Flamethrower operators suffered high casualty rates. Many never made it back from their missions. Those who survived often carried the memories with them for life. Some admitted that they felt conflicted. While their weapon saved their comrades, it also inflicted unimaginable horror on the enemy. War had always been brutal, but to unleash fire at such close range left scars on both the men who carried the weapon and those who endured it. By the time the forest campaign ended, the bunkers of the Hurtgen had been reduced one by one, many by fire. The battle demonstrated not only the tactical importance of the flamethrower but also its psychological dominance. Concrete walls could resist bullets and shells, but they could not resist fear. In the Hurtgen, the Americans proved that even the strongest fortifications could be turned into infernos. Psychological and moral impact. The flamethrower was more than a weapon, it was a psychological storm. Soldiers on both sides agreed that its effect went far beyond physical destruction. For the Germans, it created an instant sense of helplessness. A bunker that once felt like an unbreakable fortress could suddenly transform into a death trap with the pull of a trigger. Defenders who had endured days of shelling without breaking often surrendered within seconds when fire poured through a slit. Fear spread quickly, not just in the bunkers themselves, but along entire defensive lines. The rumor that flamethrower units were approaching was sometimes enough to make soldiers abandon their posts. But the psychological toll was not one-sided. American soldiers who carried flamethrowers often bore a heavy burden. Many admitted to feeling like marked men, aware that German machine gunners and snipers would single them out the moment their tanks were spotted. Others spoke of the unease that came with using such a fearsome weapon. While rifles and grenades were brutal, fire was personal. To unleash flames into a confined space meant hearing the screams of men trapped inside, and for many operators, those sounds stayed with them long after the war. The moral debates began even during the conflict itself. Some officers justified the flamethrower as a necessary evil, a way to reduce casualties by forcing quick surrenders. They argued that every burst of fire saved American lives by avoiding prolonged assaults against fortified positions. Others, however, were unsettled by the inhumanity of the weapon. Military chaplains and medical officers recorded stories of soldiers haunted by what they had done with it. Veterans later recalled that it was easier to shoot an enemy from a distance than to hear them suffer at such close range. German survivors also left accounts that reflected the sheer terror. One described the experience as facing hell itself, while another confessed that he would rather endure hours of shelling than a few moments of fire. Even after capture, the memory of those flames lingered, and many carried deep psychological scars. In the broader context of war, the flamethrower became a symbol of ultimate fear. Propaganda on both sides acknowledged its power. Germans painted it as a barbaric weapon to demonize the Allies, while American newspapers quietly emphasized its effectiveness without dwelling on its horror. Yet both soldiers and civilians understood its implications. It was not a weapon designed to win battles through destruction alone, but through the collapse of morale. By the end of the war, debates about morality intensified. Was it acceptable to use such a weapon, knowing its effects? Or was it simply another step in the long evolution of warfare, no more brutal than gas, artillery, or bombs? For those who experienced it firsthand, the answer was less abstract. For the Germans, it was terror in its purest form. For the Americans, it was a tool that saved lives while leaving behind an invisible trail of trauma. Legacy of the Inferno. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the flamethrower remained one of the most haunting legacies of the war. Unlike tanks, planes, or rifles, it was remembered less for its technological innovation and more for the raw emotions it inspired: terror, despair, and moral unease. For many German veterans, the memory of facing flamethrowers lingered longer than any artillery barrage or tank assault. The image of fire flooding through narrow slits, filling the air with smoke and unbearable heat, became a nightmare that returned in their sleep long after the war had ended. For American veterans, the legacy was just as complicated. Those who carried flamethrowers were often remembered by their comrades as heroes, men who risked everything to silence positions that no one else could reach. Yet many of these same operators confessed that their memories were among the most difficult to bear. They had seen the direct effects of their weapon at close range. They had heard the cries, smelled the smoke, and witnessed firsthand how fear could break even the strongest soldiers. To them, victory was forever mixed with a shadow of guilt. The larger world, too, took notice. In the years after the war, military strategists praised the flamethrower's effectiveness but also questioned its morality. The Geneva Conventions and subsequent international agreements began to focus more directly on limiting or banning incendiary weapons. By the time of the Korean and Vietnam Wars, flamethrowers were still used but increasingly criticized as symbols of inhumanity. Eventually, technological advances, such as precision explosives and bunker-busting munitions, replaced them, and the flamethrower faded from the battlefield. Yet its psychological impact never faded from memory. History books continue to note that while flamethrowers did not account for the largest number of casualties, their influence on morale was extraordinary. The mere threat of their use often forced defenders to surrender without a prolonged fight, proving that fear itself could be as decisive as bullets. In popular culture, the weapon became a grim icon of World War II. Films, documentaries, and memoirs returned again and again to the terrifying image of a soldier unleashing fire into a bunker. To audiences, it represented both the extremes of human ingenuity and the darkest realities of modern war. Ultimately, the flamethrower's legacy is one of contradiction. It was a tool that saved countless Allied lives by breaking hardened defenses, yet it also inflicted suffering that many considered beyond the pale of civilized warfare. It revealed the paradox of war itself, that survival often demands acts which leave deep scars on those who carry them out. For the German infantry who once believed their bunkers could protect them, the flamethrower shattered that illusion forever. For the Americans who wielded it, it was both a weapon of victory and a burden of memory. And for history, it remains a reminder that in the struggle between steel and fire, it is often fear, more than firepower, that determines the fate of men.